Hey guys, tonight we're pulling on a pair of ragged fur mittens, stepping off the beaten path and heading straight into the frozen teeth of the American wilderness. Out here, there's no thermostat, no grocery store, and definitely no heated seats waiting in a car parked outside. It's just you, your grit, and the very real chance that if you don't learn fast, the wilderness will chew you up, spit you out, and bury you under 10 feet of snow. In other words, you probably won't survive this. At least not without some serious cabin building skills, but that's exactly why we're here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not begging, I promise. I just want to hang out with the folks who find these late night dives into history as oddly relaxing as I do. While you're at it, drop your city and the time you're listening in the comments. It's always fun to see the little map of night owls that forms across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The frontier is a cruel tutor. Imagine the crunch of snow under your boots, every step heavier than the last, the cold biting through your leggings as if it were personally insulted by your attempt at warmth. The mountain men, fur trappers, traders, adventurers, had one primary mission: survive the winter. And survival wasn't just about food or firewood. It meant walls that held, roofs that didn't collapse under the weight of a storm, and doors that kept more than just drafts out. A solid cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was the line between another spring rendezvous and your bones being gnawed by wolves before the thaw. The harsh reality of these winters hit hard. Picture storms that could last a week, snow so heavy that it swallowed entire valleys, and winds that screamed through the trees like banshees. Early settlers often underestimated it, thinking they could tough it out under lean-tos or canvas tents. But here's a historical fact for you. The Lewis and Clark expedition, tough as they were, spent the brutal winter of 1805 to 1806 holed up in Fort Clatsop, a rough stockade of cabins on the Oregon coast. Even they admitted it was misery. Food spoiled, elk meat ran short, and everyone got sick from the damp. A cabin might not guarantee comfort, but it offered a fighting chance against the elements. Of course, not everything about the wilderness was grim. Some mountain men spun wild tales about how the cold could freeze alcohol solid in its jug, or that whiskey became so thick you had to scoop it with a spoon. Was that true? Probably not. But in long, snowbound nights, the imagination had a way of bending reality into something a little more entertaining. Quirky claims like these spread almost as fast as frostbite. Here's where the debates creep in. Scholars still argue about just how self-sufficient these men really were. Some say the mountain man myth exaggerates their independence, that they often relied heavily on native tribes for food, shelter, knowledge, and survival strategies. Others argue that, while there was borrowing, the sheer grit required to even last a single winter in the Rockies speaks for itself. The truth is probably tangled in between, a mix of cultural exchange and raw determination. Back in our story, the question looms, where do you even begin? You can almost feel the fear pressing down like the weight of all that snow waiting to fall. Your firewood pile will vanish in a week, and without walls, every night becomes a wrestling match with frost itself. The wilderness around you is both generous and merciless. Towering evergreens stretch in every direction, but each one demands back-breaking labour if you dare to turn it into lumber. And yet, those trees are also the bones of the cabin you need. Their resinous scent will one day be part of the smoke curling from your hearth, a smell of stubborn survival. You take a deep breath, watching it billow in white clouds. The air burns your lungs. Somewhere, a raven croaks overhead, mocking your slow progress. It feels like you've stumbled into a different world, one where time doesn't move the way it does back home. Out here, the rhythm is dictated by daylight hours and storms. The mountains don't care if you're tired, if your axe is dull, or if your fingers are numb. You have to adapt, or perish. At night, when you huddle near your small fire, the silence stretches almost too wide to bear. You can hear the pop of the logs, the distant crack of ice shifting on a river. It's easy to imagine that you're the last human alive. This is where the reality of survival sinks in. No cabin means no insulation, no place to store dried venison or furs, no shelter for the tools you need. You think about the men who came before, the ones who failed. Maybe their bones are still out there under the snowdrifts, quiet warnings carved into the landscape. And yet, a flicker of hope stays alive. Because just as easily as the wilderness threatens you, it also provides. There's wood, water, game, and stone, all raw ingredients waiting for your hands. The first winter you face might break you, but if you manage to stand up to it, you'll carry a quiet pride that city folk will never understand. That's the paradox of the wilderness. Brutal, but oddly generous to those who know how to ask it right. So here you are, staring into the shadows of the forest, realizing the only way forward is to build. You're about to transform from a wanderer into a builder, from someone passing through into someone rooted, however temporarily. The cabin isn't just a structure, it's your declaration that you belong here, at least for now. You grip your axe, flex stiff fingers, and start to think like the men who carved their lives out of silence and timber. The first lesson you learn out here is that survival isn't random, it's strategic. You can swing an axe all day and still end up dead by February if you put your cabin in the wrong place. Choosing a site is like playing chess with the wilderness, only the stakes are frostbite and starvation instead of losing a pawn. You walk the land, eyes squinting against the pale sun bouncing off snow, trying to read the terrain the way an old-timer would. Low valleys are tempting. They feel sheltered, almost cozy. But they're also cold sinks, where icy air pools like water in a basin. Spend the winter there, and you'll shiver even under the thickest buffalo robe. Higher ground might mean warmer breezes, but go too high and you're in avalanche territory, where tons of snow can sweep away your hard labour in seconds. You need balance. A place near water, protected by timber, yet high enough to catch sun when it dares to show itself. As you pause by a creek, its surface glazed with fragile ice, you imagine future mornings, hauling buckets of water, hearing the gurgle as it splashes into your wooden barrel. Fresh water is life, but too close to the banks and your cabin risks spring floods when the thaw comes. You move uphill, kicking through crusty snow, your breath fogging in rhythm with each step. Finally you find it, a gentle rise overlooking the bend of the stream, a ring of pines curving around like a natural wall. You can almost picture the smoke curling from your chimney already. Historically, this decision-making was no small matter. Mountain men knew that the wrong location could doom them. A well-chosen site was as important as the tools in their packs. Here's a fact. Many fur trading posts in the 19th century were placed at river junctions, not just for easy access to water, but because rivers were highways before roads existed. Cabins, however, were often tucked farther back, hidden from prying eyes, whether human or animal. Solitude wasn't just romantic, it was a form of security. And then there's the quirky law. Some trappers swore that you should always build where deer tracks crossed the snow, believing it meant a plentiful hunting ground nearby. Others claimed that birds could predict safe ground. If songbirds flitted through a clearing even in cold months, it was a sign the place was livable. It's not exactly peer-reviewed science, but out here, sometimes you cling to whatever guidance you can get, even if it's feathered. Yet scholars still wrestle with the question of how much thought mountain men actually gave to location. Some argue they were practical, deliberate, testing soil, watching sun patterns, and even using primitive weather signs to choose their sites. Others suggest it was often improvisation. Find a clearing, cut some trees, and hope for the best. The debate leaves you wondering, are you carefully choosing your ground like a strategist, or just gambling against nature's stacked deck? In the hush of the forest, you kneel and scoop up a handful of snow, letting it melt slowly in your palm. The icy water drips down your wrist, and you feel the weight of the decision pressing on you. This isn't just about building walls, it's about creating a pocket of survival inside an ocean of danger. You listen to the soundscape, the muted rush of the creek, the groan of trees in the wind, the occasional crack of ice splitting somewhere unseen. All of it feels like the wilderness whispering whether it approves of your choice. You pull your coat tighter and mark the ground with your boot heel. This is where it begins. You imagine future nights, the wind screaming just beyond the log walls, while inside the cabin the fire casts flickering shadows against rough-hewn planks. It's hard to picture warmth when your fingers are numb, but in a way, that imagined comfort is already a kind of heat. The next hours are spent pacing the perimeter, stepping out the rough footprint of your soon-to-be cabin. You notice the slope, just enough to keep water running away instead of pooling by your walls. You check the tree line, close enough for timber, far enough that they won't crash down onto your roof during a storm. Every decision feels enormous, though it's mostly instinct backed by the half-heard wisdom of those who've survived before. At sunset, you sit on a fallen log watching the sky blush with fading light. The temperature drops with cruel speed, and the land stiffens around you. You wonder if you've chosen wisely, or if this rise will betray you come midwinter. Doubt creeps in, as it always does, but then you remind yourself, every mountain man started with uncertainty. The only way to know for sure is to build and endure, and so, with night gathering like a blanket of ink, you whisper a quiet promise to the ground beneath your boots. You'll shape this spot into something livable, something stubborn enough to resist the wild cold. Tomorrow, the real labour begins. Tonight, you rest with the knowledge that at least you've picked the stage for your survival story. Morning creeps into the wilderness slowly, as if even the sun doesn't really want to face the bitter chill. You wake stiff, wrapped in a blanket that never seems thick enough, and stretch your arms against the aching cold. Today the land stops being just a backdrop. You're about to mark it, claim it, bend it into something resembling your own. No grand-deed papers, no fences, no sheriff's office stamping approval. Out here, your title is whatever you can carve with an axe and a steady hand. Marking your territory is both declaration and defence. Without it, another wanderer might stroll by, decide your spot looks cosy, and set up his own fire where yours should be. The first step is primitive but effective: notching trees. You take your axe, lift it high, and bring it down with a satisfying thunk into the trunk of a spruce near the creek. Chips of bark fly, the sharp resin smell filling the air like pine incense. You carve a deep blaze mark, visible from a distance, your sign that this ground is spoken for. You repeat the ritual on the trees that roughly outline your chosen rectangle. It's almost ceremonial. The wilderness doesn't care about your cuts, but you do, and that makes all the difference. Historically, this was common practice. Trappers, settlers, and even early surveyors left their marks on trees, using notches, initials, or crude symbols to indicate boundaries. It wasn't foolproof, of course. A man's claim was only as strong as his ability to defend it. Still, it worked well enough that the tradition lasted for centuries. Some old blazed trees even survive today, silent witnesses to long-forgotten survival struggles. But leave it to mountain men to add a twist. Some carved not just marks, but strange pictographs, animal shapes, arrows, or what looked suspiciously like crude faces. Quirky stories grew around these symbols. One tale claimed that a trapper drew a coiled snake on a tree to scare off trespassers, and locals swore no one dared camp near it for years. Whether fear of curses or just respect for another man's boldness kept folks away, it shows how even the wildest loners understood the power of suggestion. Of course, scholars bicker over how serious these markings really were. Some argue that territory claims were honoured loosely, if at all, since the land was too vast and resources too plentiful to bother with disputes. Others insist that the marks were critical, especially near rivers or passes where every decent site mattered. It's one of those grey areas of history where myth and practicality blur, leaving us to imagine men negotiating ownership in grunts, glares, and the occasional fistfight. Back in your boots, you step back to admire the rough perimeter you've created. The marked trees form a kind of invisible fence, your silent promise that this ground will soon hold something sturdier than hope. The land doesn't look different to anyone else, but to you it's transformed. This is no longer just forest, it's your future cabin's footprint, your claim to a sliver of existence in the middle of nowhere. To strengthen the idea, you pile a few rocks at one corner, stacking them into a crude marker. It's not impressive, just a few chunks of granite balanced together, but it feels oddly satisfying, like leaving a signature. You wonder how many others have done the same before you, how many piles of stones dot these mountains, each one a small monument to stubborn survival. The work is exhausting in its simplicity. Notching trees, carrying stones, stamping boot prints into frozen ground until your legs ache. Yet by the time the weak daylight fades, you feel an almost foolish pride. It's like putting up scaffolding for a life that doesn't exist yet. Every mark is a whisper saying, "I will endure here." And with that comes an unexpected sense of comfort. You're no longer just drifting. You've drawn boundaries in the endless wild, given shape to a dream of shelter. When you huddle by your fire that night, listening to the crackle and pop, you don't feel entirely at the mercy of the world anymore. Instead, you feel like someone who belongs, not because the wilderness has welcomed you, but because you've dared to carve your initials into its silence. The next morning greets you with a sky so clear it almost feels like a trick. The mountains loom sharp against the pale blue, snow glittering like powdered glass on their shoulders. It's the kind of day that whispers, "Work while you can," because storms always lurk on the horizon. You tighten your belt, pull on stiff boots, and set your sights on the true test of endurance, felling the giants that will become your cabin walls. You approach the tree line with your axe resting across your shoulder. The forest feels both welcoming and threatening, like a cathedral that might crush you with one wrong move. Every tree is a potential beam, but also a mountain of work waiting to flatten your spirit. You place a hand against the bark of a tall pine, its trunk cold and solid, and picture it as the spine of your shelter. This isn't just cutting firewood, it's choosing which giants to bring down so that you can stand against the winter. Historically, mountain men and early settlers relied on simple steel axes, often traded from blacksmiths or fur posts. These weren't lightweight tools. They were heavy, wedge-shaped beasts that demanded stamina and rhythm. A skilled man could drop a tree in under an hour, but for most it was an all-morning ordeal. One historical fact: the Kentucky axe, with its long blade and curved edge, became especially prized in the early 1800s for its efficiency in shaping logs. With the right swing, it was less about brute force and more about momentum. Still, lore paints some wild exaggerations. Old campfire tales claim that certain men could cut through a trunk faster than a beaver, and one tall story insists a trapper named Big Jack once dropped a cottonwood with only 5 blows. Realistically, unless he had arms like tree trunks and an axe kissed by magic, it's unlikely. But exaggeration was half the fun. When the nights were long, a little myth-making helped pass the time. Scholars debate whether these men worked alone or cooperated when felling logs. Some accounts suggest the image of the solitary mountain man was overblown, and that partners often teamed up, trading blows on opposite sides of the trunk. Others argue the sheer independence of the lifestyle meant most of this brutal labour was endured solo. The evidence is scattered, leaving us to imagine both scenarios: 2 men laughing through the sweat of a long day, or one man gritting his teeth against the echo of his own axe strokes. Back in your hands, the axe feels heavier with each swing. The sound carries through the trees, a solid thwack, then another, and another, each one biting deeper into the wood. Chips fly, scattering across the snow like curled ribbons. The smell of sap fills your nostrils, sharp and sweet, clinging to your gloves. Sweat trickles down your back despite the cold, steam rising from your shoulders. There's a rhythm to it, a primitive drumbeat echoing through the forest as your pulse syncs with the swing. Hours pass, your arms ache. Your grip slips once, leaving a raw spot on your palm. But finally, the tree groans, shudders, and leans into its fall. You step back, heart racing, as it crashes down with a roar that shakes the earth beneath your boots. The silence afterward feels holy, as if the forest has acknowledged your effort. One giant down, many more to go. By dusk you've marked several trunks, each one destined for walls, roof beams or firewood. You drag smaller branches aside, clearing the fallen timbers so you can return to them tomorrow. The scale of the work is daunting. Each tree felled is just the beginning. Hauling, trimming, shaping all lie ahead. Yet there's a quiet pride in the raw pile of logs at your feet, proof of progress carved from muscle and will. That night, by your small fire, you turn over the day in your mind. You imagine the logs stacked into a fortress, snow sliding harmlessly off a sloped roof, warmth trapped inside like a secret. It's still a dream, but now it feels tangible. Every axe swing has edged you closer to survival. You close your eyes, listening to the crackle, and almost hear the future echoing in the flames. The sound of winter winds testing walls that will not yield. The trees you've brought down lie sprawled across the snow like sleeping beasts, their branches jutting out in wild angles, their sheer size mocking the idea that you could ever tame them. Cutting them was one kind of labour. Hauling them to where your cabin will rise is a whole new torment. You stand over the first trunk, boots sinking into the crust, and realise there's no shortcut here. A log doesn't care about your aching muscles or your hunger. It just waits, daring you to move it inch by inch. The old mountain men knew this pain all too well. A single log could weigh hundreds of pounds, and without teams of oxen or draft horses, moving them was a grim exercise in stubbornness. If you were lucky, you had a mule or two, strong enough to drag, but stubborn enough to test your patience. If not, it came down to levers, ropes, and sheer grit. Here's a historical fact. Settlers often used skid poles, smaller logs laid like rails, to roll larger timbers closer to their building site. It wasn't elegant, but it saved backs and bones from snapping under the strain. Of course, where there's history, there's exaggeration. Tall tales tell of men dragging logs for miles single-handed, their boots leaving ruts in the earth, their shoulders broad enough to carry beams. Some stories even insisted that one particularly hulking trapper hauled an entire wall's worth of logs uphill in a single afternoon. Maybe he was fueled by whiskey. Maybe it was the kind of memory that got stronger with every retelling. Either way, the reality was slower, grittier, and far less glamorous, and scholars still debate just how much help mountain men really had. Did they truly labour alone, like the legends suggest, or did they cooperate more than the myth allows, swapping manpower, trading muscle for coffee or jerky? Some diaries hint at both. Independence was prized, but when it came to dragging half a forest into one clearing, even the proudest loner might accept a neighbour's hand. That tension between solitary myth and communal reality is what makes the story of these cabins so complicated. For you, though, there's no debate. You're the one standing here, staring at a log that doesn't want to move. You knot a rope around its middle, wedge a stick beneath as a lever, and strain with every ounce of strength. The log shifts grudgingly, sliding across the snow with a long groan. Your breath explodes in frosty bursts, your gloves slip, and your boots dig trenches behind you. Progress is slow, painful, but undeniable. After hours of dragging, rolling, and muttered curses, you manage to pull 3 logs into the clearing. They rest there like the bones of some enormous skeleton, waiting to be arranged into the shape of survival. Your shoulders burn, your lower back screams, but there's a grim satisfaction in seeing them pile up. Each log is a step closer to walls that will hold back the cold. As the day wanes, you catch yourself imagining the stories these timbers could tell. How many winters did they weather before your axe brought them down? How many storms cracked their branches? How many owls nested in their hollows? You've ended their life as trees, but you're giving them a second as guardians of your own. That thought steadies you, even as fatigue presses hard. By the time the sky bruises purple with twilight, you've hauled enough logs to outline the first rough corner of your future home. It doesn't look like much yet, a few timbers stacked in the snow, but to your tired eyes it's monumental. You sink onto one of them, feeling the icy bark against your coat, and let your breath fog upward into the quiet. The wilderness doesn't applaud, but in its silence you hear something like respect. That night every muscle screams as you crawl under your blanket. The fire crackles low, painting the dark with flickers of orange. You close your eyes and see the day replayed in fragments. The drag of the rope, the sting in your palms, the triumphant shift of a log finally giving way. It's exhausting, brutal work, but it's progress. And progress, out here, is the only thing standing between you and the winter that waits just beyond the trees. The next day, when you wake to the brittle crack of ice shifting on the creek, your mind isn't on cutting or hauling anymore. It's on shape. Up until now, the work has been about raw materials, trees transformed into logs, logs dragged into piles. But piles don't keep out snowstorms. Piles don't hold a fire's heat. To turn those timbers into something resembling a home, you have to imagine the bones of your cabin and lay down its footprint. The forest floor in your clearing is uneven, littered with stumps, roots, and the faint scars of your dragging paths. You stamp your boots in the snow, mentally sketching rectangles, shifting corners, until the image of 4 walls finally settles in your mind. The process feels ceremonial, though in reality it's practical. Most cabins of the early frontier were simple rectangles, about 12 by 16 feet, sometimes smaller if time and energy were tight. Large enough to stretch out, small enough to heat without burning through every stick of wood you had. Historical fact: the log cabins built by early settlers in Appalachia often followed this exact plan, passed down from Scotch-Irish immigrants who'd been building rough timber homes for centuries. A tried-and-true shape, imported and modified for new frontiers. Of course, there's always a little folklore tangled in. Stories drifted around campfires about men who built circular cabins, claiming the shape made it easier for heat to circulate evenly. Others swore that building in odd shapes, pentagons, hexagons, confused evil spirits who might try to slip inside at night. Was anyone really laying out geometric experiments in the Rockies? Probably not. but the human need to mix superstition with survival is as old as the cold itself. Here's where scholars disagree. Some argue that the simple rectangle design was purely about efficiency. Minimal notching, less wasted timber, easy to roof. Others believe that cultural traditions played a bigger role, that men shaped their cabins not just for survival, but as echoes of homes they'd left behind. The debate adds depth to what might otherwise seem like just a box of logs. Was a cabin merely a shield from the cold, or was it also an attempt to recreate a memory of belonging in a land that wanted you gone? Back in your clearing, you take your axe and carve shallow grooves in the snow and frozen earth, marking the four corners of your soon-to-be fortress. The rectangle you create feels small at first, almost laughably cramped compared to the vast wilderness around you. But then you imagine the fire's glow bouncing off close walls, the roof low enough to trap warmth, the shelves stacked with dried meat. Suddenly, small feels smart. You set stones at the corners, rough placeholders for where walls will rise. Your breath clouds in the air as you step back to study the outline. It doesn't look like much, just a box scratched into snow and dirt. But you feel the weight of its promise. Each corner marks not just space but defiance, your quiet refusal to be buried by the winter pressing at the edge of the trees. As you pace the boundaries again, you think about future details, where the door will stand, where light might creep through a tiny window, where you'll sit on storm days carving wood scraps into something vaguely useful. You imagine a hearth at one end, stones stacked high, smoke curling upward. None of it exists yet, but you can already see shadows dancing on those walls, hear the muffled howl of wind outside, smell the mix of smoke, pine and tanned hides. The day slips by in small adjustments. You widen one side of the rectangle, shorten another, shuffle stones until the footprint feels balanced. It's not perfection you're after. It's survival geometry, where every foot shaved off means less wall to build, less roof to patch, less air to heat. By sundown, the outline is set. It may be invisible to anyone else, but to you, it's the blueprint of survival etched into the frozen ground. That night, when the fire dies low, you lie awake imagining the rectangle taking form. You picture the first log being set down, the sound of it thudding into place, the slow rise of walls against the endless dark. It's almost enough to make you forget the cold, at least until the wind sneaks through your blanket again. But even then, you smile to yourself. The cabin is no longer a dream floating in your mind. It has a shape, a footprint. And soon, the forest around you will bow to that design, with the footprint scratched into the earth and stones sitting like silent sentinels at the corners. The next task stares at you with the patience of inevitability, shaping the ends of each log so they'll lock together. Without this, your cabin is just a stack of slippery timber waiting to collapse under the first snow load. Notching corners is the real craft, where brute force meets skill and where a man proves whether he can think as well as swing an axe. You kneel by the first log, your axe head gleaming faintly in the pale light, and mutter to yourself, "All right, let's make this stick." Notching has always been the quiet genius of cabin building. A proper notch ensures that logs fit snugly, overlapping without sliding apart. The most common method? The saddle notch, a rounded groove carved into the underside of a log so it can nestle against the curve of the one below. Historical fact: the saddle notch was a Scandinavian technique brought to America by immigrants, particularly those who settled in the northern states where timber was plentiful. Mountain men picked it up through observation or necessity, adapting it to the tools and trees at hand. It wasn't fancy joinery, it was survival carpentry, rough but functional. Still, frontier folklore couldn't resist dressing it up. Some trappers swore that if you cut your notches on a waxing moon, the logs would last longer without rot. Others joked that the tighter the notch, the less likely wolves would slip between the cracks at night. Practical advice? Not exactly. But when you're whittling into frozen wood by firelight, muttering about moon phases feels oddly reassuring. Scholars debate whether most cabins really used refined notching, or if many were simply cribbed, logs stacked with minimal shaping, gaps chinked later with mud and moss. Some evidence suggests that lone trappers in a hurry went with crude builds, while more permanent settlements leaned on the skill of notching to keep cabins standing for decades. Was every mountain man a careful craftsman, or were most just hacking at wood until it stayed put? The truth, as usual, likely lies in the middle. You take your first swing carving a shallow groove into the end of a log, Chips fly, sap glistens, and the cold air fills with that sweet resin smell again. The axe blade thuds rhythmically, like a heartbeat against wood. It's painstaking work. You have to cut, test, cut again, shaving the curve just right so one log can cradle the next without wobbling. After an hour, your shoulders scream, but you finally set the notched log atop its partner and watch it settle into place with a satisfying thunk. Suddenly, the outline in the snow isn't just imaginary anymore, it's beginning to rise. Each notch is a battle. The wood splinters stubbornly, sometimes tearing in uneven chunks that force you to adjust your cut. You wipe sweat from your forehead, even as icy wind bites your cheeks. The rhythm of axe against log becomes almost meditative. Swing, chip, adjust, test. You fall into a trance where the only sounds are steel biting wood and the occasional caw of a distant raven, as if the bird is critiquing your craftsmanship. By midday, you've managed to notch and stack 3 logs on one side, the walls beginning to form a waist-high barrier. The sight fills you with a strange pride. This isn't just labour anymore, it's structure. The rectangle is slowly becoming 3-dimensional, a boundary between inside and outside. You run your hand along the rough bark, feeling the grooves where your axe bit deep, and imagine these walls standing firm under storms that would flatten a lesser shelter. The work is slow, but the progress is visible, and that's fuel enough to keep going. You notch another log, muscles burning, breath puffing in white clouds, until the sun dips low and shadows stretch long across the snow. Exhausted, you step back and see the beginnings of a corner, a real corner, solid and interlocked. It may not look like much to anyone else, but to you it's the hinge point between survival and surrender. That night, by the fire, you rub your blistered palms and stare into the flames. The day replays in your mind, the feel of the axe handle, the thunk of wood locking into wood, the silhouette of rising walls. You're no master carpenter, but you've crossed a threshold. With each notch cut, each log stacked, you're teaching the wilderness that you're not just passing through. You're here to stay, at least as long as the snow lets you. By now your clearing has the beginnings of walls, a waist-high outline of logs stacked with notches biting into each other like puzzle pieces. But a stack of logs is not a cabin until the walls rise tall enough to shut out the wind. This is where the real grind begins, raising logs that seem to get heavier with every layer. Each one must be lifted, rolled, and coaxed into place, and the higher you go, the more dangerous the work becomes. Standing there with your axe resting across your shoulders, you look up at the empty air above those rough corners and sigh. The wilderness isn't going to build your walls for you. Historically, raising log walls was the moment when a cabin began to feel like more than a camp. It was also the most back-breaking part of construction. Men used poles as ramps, rolling logs upward with levers or sheer brute strength, balancing them precariously before notching them into place. One fact worth remembering: pioneers often relied on a cribbing technique, stacking logs slightly inward with each layer to create stability. Some cabins even narrowed toward the roofline for this reason. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the structure standing when the snow came. Frontier folklore, of course, added spice to the tale. Some swore that certain mountain men could toss a log onto a wall single-handed, as if they were giants disguised in buckskin. Others told stories of cabins going up in a single day, raised so quickly that by sunset smoke was already curling from the chimney. Realistically, even with a team, building a cabin wall that fast would be miraculous, but around the fire the stories kept spirits warm when bodies were cold. Scholarly debates circle around whether solitary trappers really built full-size cabins alone. Some evidence suggests they did, slowly and painfully, dragging and lifting logs until exhaustion forced them to stop. Others argue that the iconic lone builder was more myth than reality, that most cabins were raised communally, with small groups pitching in so everyone had a roof before winter. Diaries and archaeological remains hint at both, leaving us to wonder if our image of the solitary mountain man is truth, or just a legend we like better. Back in your clearing, it feels like the solitary version is your fate. You set up ramps from smaller poles, roll a log toward them, and begin the awkward dance of heaving it upward. Every muscle in your back strains, your boots slip against the icy ground, and the log groans as if mocking you. Slowly, inch by inch, you lever it into place, guiding it into its notch with a hollow thud that echoes through the trees. Standing back, you wipe sweat from your brow and grin. One more layer stands between you and the world. The day stretches into a blur of repetition. Roll, lift, notch, step back. The walls climb higher, each log adding weight and permanence to the structure. By mid-afternoon, you've reached chest height, and the wind that once tore through the clearing is now partially blocked. You notice the difference immediately. The fire in your pit doesn't sputter as much. Your breath doesn't carry so far. It's subtle, but it's proof that you're clawing your way toward real shelter. As the sun dips low, painting the snow in pink and gold, you pause to admire the skeleton of your cabin. The walls are uneven in places, gaps yawning where your notches weren't perfect. But it's unmistakably a structure now. The corners stand proud, the logs interlocked like hands clasped against the storm. You touch one of the upper beams, rough bark scraping your palm, and imagine the walls continuing upward until they cradle a roof. For the first time, the clearing doesn't feel like a campsite, it feels like a home in progress. That night your body screams with fatigue. Every joint aches and your hands are raw despite your gloves. But as you lie near the fire, staring at the rough silhouette of walls rising in the dark, you feel a deep satisfaction. You've turned trees into shelter, muscle into permanence. The wilderness might still have the upper hand, but with each log raised, you're stealing a little ground back. And tomorrow, you'll climb higher still, until the forest bows to the weight of your stubborn determination. Now the walls stand shoulder high, and the skeleton of your cabin has started to whisper promises of warmth. But between those stacked logs, winter still peers in like an uninvited guest. The gaps are as wide as a man's fingers, and the wind slides through them with cruel precision, sharp enough to sting your skin even when you're inside the half-finished shell. A cabin without sealed gaps is nothing more than a giant flute, one that whistles icy death straight into your bones. That's where the messy, overlooked but utterly vital job of chinking comes in. You squat near the wall, running your hand along the cold grooves where bark meets bark. The gaps gape like toothless mouths, waiting to be stuffed with whatever you can find. Historically, that whatever was an eclectic mix. Moss, mud, clay, straw, even animal hair, all pressed into cracks to seal out the cold. One fact stands clear. Mountain men were nothing if not resourceful. Archaeologists have even found remnants of fur and shredded hides crammed between timbers in old cabins, proof that nothing went to waste when warmth was on the line. Of course, the folklore around chinking leans more toward the absurd. Some tales claim trappers used chewed tobacco mixed with mud, swearing the smell kept away insects and spirits alike. Others insisted that a chunk of bear fat in the cracks made walls more wolf-proof. Did anyone really slather their homes with lard? Probably not, unless they enjoyed being visited by every hungry animal in the forest. Still, when stories get told around a fire, practicality has a way of bowing to entertainment. Here's the scholarly debate. Was chinking more of a long-term craft or a slapdash solution? Some historians argue that careful chinking was a point of pride, done meticulously so a cabin could last years. Others point out that many trappers only needed their shelters for one winter, so they crammed in mud and moss quickly, with little care for how long it held. The divide reflects a larger question about these men. Were they truly building homes, or just temporary cocoons until spring thaw? You kneel in the snow and begin your own patchwork. First, you gather moss, its green still stubborn under the frost. You pack it into the cracks, pressing hard with numb fingers until it clings like natural insulation. Next comes mud, mixed with snow, stomped with your boots until it turns into something vaguely pliable. You smear it into the seams, your gloves coated, your breath hissing in irritation as clumps fall free. Slowly the wall begins to look less like a sieve and more like a shield. The process is exhausting and messy. You scrape your knuckles, mud crusts under your nails, and a chunk of half-frozen moss slides down your sleeve. But the difference is immediate. When you crouch inside your rising cabin and the wind howls outside, the breeze no longer slices through every crack. It's still cold, frigid even, but there's a noticeable dulling, as though the walls are learning to hold their ground against the elements. By midday, you've sealed most of the gaps on one side, your body aching in new ways from the crouching and pressing. The wall now looks like a patchwork quilt. Green, brown, and frozen grey streaks marking your labour. Not pretty, but beauty isn't the goal. Survival is. You lean back, shoulders against the logs, and close your eyes. For a brief moment, it almost feels like the world has paused its assault, letting you rest in a bubble of stillness. As twilight settles in, you finish stuffing the last seam with a wad of moss and frozen mud. The cabin's silhouette now feels sturdier, more dignified. It's not perfect. Snowmelt will drip through, and some gaps will widen again with shifting wood. But for tonight, it's enough. The wilderness no longer blows through unchecked. Instead, it stops, presses against your handiwork, and hesitates. Later, by the fire, you notice how the flames hold steady, no longer flickering violently with every gust. Your blanket feels a touch warmer. You smile into the darkness, mud still drying on your hands. This cabin may look rough, patched together like a beggar's coat, but in its seams lies the difference between despair and hope. And for the first time since you started, you believe you might actually outlast the winter. Your walls may be sturdy and your seams stuffed with moss and mud, but without a roof you're still living in a glorified pen. Snow will fall straight in, rain will soak your bedding, and the first storm will remind you how temporary your progress really is. The roof is what turns a pile of logs into a fortress, a lid on your box of survival. You step outside into the brittle air, looking at your half-built walls with a builder's eye. They're solid enough now to bear the weight, but the real question is what kind of covering you can manage before the skies open up. Historically, cabin roofs were as varied as the men who built them. Shakes split from logs, bark peeled from birches, sod heaved from the frozen ground. All were used, depending on what the land offered. One clear fact: bark roofs were common in the Rockies, where pine and spruce shed wide sheets that could be stripped and laid in overlapping layers. They weren't waterproof forever, but they'd keep out snow for a season or two. Longer-term builders sometimes shaped planks into shingles or shakes, but that meant even more cutting, splitting and fitting. A winter cabin often got the quick solution, because time was the enemy. The quirky tales around roofing are almost as creative as the roofs themselves. Some trappers swore that lining the roof with buffalo hides made it so snug you could smoke a pipe indoors without a wisp escaping. Others joked about cabins so poorly built that owls nested between the rafters, swooping down to steal jerky right off the table. It's hard to say if any man truly waterproofed his home with animal skins, but the image of a wolfskin roof catching moonlight feels too stubbornly poetic to dismiss outright. Scholars still wrestle with the evidence. Were most mountain men content with bark and sod that barely lasted one winter, or did they invest the time in proper shakes? Some argue that practicality always ruled. The goal was to survive, not decorate. Others suggest that when men stayed in one region longer, they put surprising care into their roofs, even experimenting with double layers or clever drainage systems. The debate touches a larger question. Were these cabins disposable tools, or the beginnings of something resembling permanence? For you, there's no luxury of endless choice. Bark is your ally. You score long cuts into the trunk of a nearby spruce, then pry loose sheets of bark, their inner sides damp and fibrous. They come off like stiff blankets, rough and uneven but wide enough to overlap. You haul them to the clearing, stack them by the wall, and look up at the naked beams that will hold them. Each sheet will need to be wedged and weighted with smaller poles, a patchwork roof stitched together by sheer stubbornness. The work is clumsy, exhausting, and sometimes comical. You climb onto the half-raised walls, balancing awkwardly while hoisting sheets of bark overhead. The first one slips and smacks you in the face, leaving resin smeared across your cheek. Another cracks down the middle as you try to bend it into place. Still, piece by piece, the covering grows. You wedge poles across the sheets, pinning them tight so the wind can't peel them off in the first storm. By afternoon, half the roof is in place, and already the space inside feels different. The light dims, shadows stretch, and the air holds a muted hush. You stand inside your cabin for the first time under partial cover, and though the bark still leaks daylight through its cracks, it feels like stepping into another world, a world where the sky is no longer pressing directly down on you. As dusk bleeds into the treetops, you finish the last section, weighting the final sheet with 2 thick poles. You drop to the ground, every muscle trembling, and tilt your head back to admire your crooked but complete roof. From outside, it looks like a lumpy quilt draped over rough walls, but to you, it's nothing short of triumph. That night, as snowflakes drift lazily from the dark sky, you sit inside and watch them land on the bark above, sliding down instead of falling on your head. The firelight flickers against the low ceiling, and for the first time the space feels like a room, imperfect, leaky but undeniably yours. You pull your blanket tighter, listening to the muffled hiss of snow outside, and think, a roof isn't just protection, it's proof. Proof that you've staked a claim, that you've wrestled a little more ground away from winter's grip. With the roof finally slung across your walls like a patchwork quilt, you step inside and take a long, satisfied breath. Then it hits you. Beneath your boots, the ground is still just frozen earth, uneven, damp, and cold enough to suck the warmth straight out of your bones. A man can pile logs high and lay bark thick, but if he spends his nights lying on raw dirt, winter will creep into his body from the ground up. The next task is unavoidable, crafting a floor, or at least taming the one nature gave you. Historically, most cabins started with dirt floors, tamped down until they were hard as stone. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. Some settlers later added plank flooring when they had time and saws enough to spare, but for mountain men rushing against the clock of winter, packed earth was the norm. Here's a fact. Accounts from early frontier forts describe soldiers sprinkling sand over their dirt floors to keep them dry, replacing it when it grew foul. The dirt floor was humble, but it worked, provided you kept it clean and solid. Naturally, frontier law had to make dirt floors sound more colourful than they were. Some claimed the trick was to pour whiskey into the soil before tamping it, because it hardened faster. Others swore a floor sprinkled with ashes from the first fire would drive away evil spirits and nosy rodents alike. Did anyone actually waste whiskey on mud? Doubtful, though maybe one drunk trapper gave it a try. Still, the stories prove that even the ground beneath your boots became fertile soil for superstition. And then there's the scholarly argument. Were dirt floors really good enough? Or were they simply the best that desperate men could manage? Some historians argue that the simple earth floor was efficient and low maintenance, while others insist it was a mark of poverty and transience, replaced whenever possible with planks. The debate isn't just about flooring. It's about whether mountain men were content with impermanence or secretly longed for something closer to the homes they'd left behind. You grab a stout branch and begin raking the ground inside your cabin, scraping away roots, rocks, and frozen clumps. The work is slow and tedious, but it begins to reveal patches of smoother soil. Then comes the tamping, stomping and pounding with your boots, driving the ground flat, your legs aching with the repetition. The sound is dull and heavy, like drum beats in the belly of the earth. Slowly, the cabin floor starts to feel less like a patch of wilderness and more like a surface meant for living. You decide to sprinkle a thin layer of sand and ash from last night's fire across one corner, packing it in as you go. The scent of charred wood mixes with damp soil, earthy and smoky, oddly comforting. It feels like sealing the ground with a ritual, binding it to your survival. When you kneel and press your palm against the packed dirt, it no longer crumbles beneath your hand. It holds. By midday, you've managed to smooth and tamp the entire footprint. The space feels different now. When you step inside, your boots don't sink awkwardly, and the cold doesn't radiate up quite as fiercely. It's still dirt, yes, but it's dirt transformed, ordered, tamed, claimed. You imagine throwing down a fur robe, stretching out, and finally sleeping without feeling like the earth itself is gnawing the heat from your bones. Later, as you sit by your fire, staring at the finished floor, you realize how symbolic this step feels. Walls may shield you, roofs may cover you, but the floor is what roots you. You're no longer camped on the forest's edge. You're standing in a place shaped by your hands, pressed into permanence beneath your feet. It's a subtle difference, but one that makes you feel, perhaps for the first time, that you belong here. That night, when you lay your blanket on the packed ground, it doesn't feel like wilderness anymore. It feels like a room. The fire crackles, the roof shelters, and the dirt beneath you holds steady. The storm howls outside, but inside you drift towards sleep, lulled by the quiet pride of knowing that even the earth itself has been pressed into service for your survival. Your cabin now has walls that block the wind, seams stuffed with moss, and a roof that shrugs off the first snowflakes. The ground beneath your boots is tamped and firm, no longer a marsh of frozen roots, but one truth gnaws at you in the quiet of night. Without a fire, none of this matters. You can sleep under a roof, you can sprawl across a floor, but if you don't build a hearth, the cold will seep in and finish what hunger and exhaustion couldn't. A hearth isn't just warmth, it's the heart of the cabin, the line between shelter and tomb. You step outside, scanning the creek bank for stones. The ground crunches beneath your boots, and frost sparks in the pale light. Rocks are heavy, awkward, and reluctant to move, but they're essential. Historically, mountain cabins almost always featured a stone hearth, however crude. It wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Fireplaces drew smoke upward, away from lungs, while their thick walls stored heat, radiating it long after flames died down. Fact: archaeologists have found traces of soot-stained chimneys still standing centuries after the cabins themselves rotted away. The stone outlives the wood, just as fire outlives the cold, for a while. The folklore around fireplaces, though, adds a strange charm. Some men swore that if you laid your first stone crooked, no matter how you rebuilt, the chimney would always smoke back into the cabin. Others claimed that tossing a silver coin into the mortar would keep lightning from striking the roof. There's even a tale about a trapper who lined his hearth with bones instead of stones, insisting it burned hotter. Did anyone really roast venison over a fireplace built of femurs? Hopefully not, but out here, who knows? Scholars argue endlessly about how sophisticated these hearths really were. Some insist that most were crude piles of stones, little more than smoky fire pits shoved against a wall. Others point to evidence of carefully mortared chimneys, crafted with skill and meant to last. Were mountain men just scraping by with temporary fixes, or did some of them bring genuine masonry knowledge into the wilderness? The debate underscores how varied these builders really were, part survivalists, part artisans, depending on who held the axe and shovel. Back in your clearing, you haul stone after stone to the cabin, stacking them into a rough square at one end of the room. The labour is punishing. Your shoulders groan, your back protests, and your gloves wear thin. Still, the pile grows, stone faces grinding against one another with a sound that feels older than history itself. You smear mud between gaps, crude mortar that will harden in the cold, sealing cracks just enough to hold. The chimney rises log by log, each stone locked into the next until it reaches above the cabin wall. Smoke must rise, not linger, if you want to keep your lungs clear and your nights warm. By mid-afternoon, the hearth is complete, a squat, uneven tower of rock pressed together with determination more than skill. It isn't pretty, but it has presence, a weight that makes the cabin feel anchored. You kneel before it, hands raw, and strike flint against steel. Sparks shower onto a twist of dry moss, which smoulders, then catches. Flames lick upward, crackling against the cold air. You feed the fire carefully, sticks first, then thicker branches until the hearth glows with steady light. The smoke rises, curling through the chimney. A little seeps back, stinging your eyes, but most drifts upward, spilling into the night. You laugh, hoarse and relieved. It works. The cabin fills with warmth, faint at first but undeniable, seeping into your clothes, thawing your fingers, loosening the knot in your chest. For the first time, you're not just hiding from the cold, you're fighting it back. That night you lie beside the flickering hearth, listening to the stones tick and groan as they expand in the heat. The fire pops, sparks leap, and shadows dance across the rough log walls. The air smells of smoke and pine resin, sharp yet comforting. You close your eyes and think of how far you've come, from sleeping under the sky to resting within walls that hold both flame and hope. The cabin is still raw, unfinished, fragile in the face of true winter. But tonight, it feels alive. The hearth has given it a heart, and you know as long as fire burns within these stones, you've carved out one small circle of warmth in a wilderness determined to freeze you out. With fire dancing inside your new stone hearth, your cabin finally breathes warmth into the frozen night. But every time you step outside, a gust of wind shoves the cold back in through the yawning entrance. You've got walls, a roof, even a glowing chimney, but without a door, you're living in a box with one side missing. Tonight, while you try to sleep, the wind whines through the open frame like a wolf testing your patience. Tomorrow you'll wrestle with lumber again, this time to make a barrier that swings shut and keeps the wilderness on the other side. Doors on frontier cabins were never elegant, but they were always essential. Historical fact: most were fashioned from vertical planks split from logs, fastened together with cross braces, and hung on simple wooden hinges. Iron hardware was rare in the wilderness, unless you'd hauled it from a trading post, so ingenuity took the place of blacksmith skill. Leather straps, wooden pegs, even rawhide lashings stood in for hinges. A door wasn't about style, it was about survival, keeping bears, snow, and nosy neighbours out while trapping the fragile warmth within. Of course, trappers told stranger stories about their doors. One legend claimed a man used a single slab of bark so wide it served as both door and conversation piece. Another tale tells of a mountain hermit whose door was nothing more than a stretched buffalo hide. Supposedly he said it kept out the cold just fine, though it must have flapped like a drum every time the wind blew. Quirky, definitely, practical, only until the first blizzard tore it loose. Scholars debate how carefully these doors were made. Some argue that even the roughest cabins had surprisingly solid entrances, since losing a door midwinter could mean death. Others suggest that many trappers made do with crude coverings, blankets of hide, slabs leaned in place, because the cabin itself was meant to last only one season. Was every mountain man carving out a sturdy swinging door, or did most accept the bare minimum so they could focus on trapping and trade? The evidence is scattered, leaving you to build your own answer. Back in your clearing, you select a straight pine log and split it lengthwise, sweat steaming off your back despite the icy air. The planks are rough, uneven, but wide enough to line up side by side. You lay them flat, brace them across with shorter pieces, and hammer in wooden pegs you've whittled from spare branches. Slowly, a slab of wood begins to take shape, heavy and awkward but solid. You heave it upright, resting it against the open frame, and can't help but grin. For the first time, the cabin feels like it has a face. The hinges are trickier. You slice thick strips of rawhide, stretching them until they're taut, then loop them through holes in the door and cabin frame. They creak as you test the swing, stiff but workable. The door groans when you push it, scraping against the packed dirt floor, but eventually it settles shut with a heavy thud. The sound reverberates through the small cabin like a drumbeat of triumph. You step outside, take hold of the rough wooden handle you've shaped, and pull it closed behind you. The cabin disappears from sight, swallowed in shadow, but the thud of the door tells you it's there, holding. You open it again, step back inside, and close it once more. Each repetition feels like a spell, open to the wild, shut for safety. The ritual of it fills you with quiet satisfaction. That night, you lie close to the fire, listening to the wind push and claw at the walls. The door rattles faintly, its rawhide hinges stretching and settling, but it holds. No more icy drafts cutting straight through your bones, no more snow drifting in by the handful, just the glow of the hearth, the hush of your cabin, and the knowledge that you've drawn a line between yourself and everything outside. For the first time, the wilderness is on the other side of a barrier you built with your own hands. The door groans in its rawhide hinges, the stone hearth glows, and the packed dirt floor lies flat beneath your boots. Your cabin is beginning to feel like a fortress, but it still lacks the most important proof of life. Fire that burns steadily inside its walls. Not a smoky sputter, not a pile of embers that dies when the wind shifts, but a flame that roars back at the winter. Tonight, you're going to light your first real fire in the hearth and see whether the cabin truly holds against the season waiting at its doorstep. Historically, the first fire in a new cabin carried more than practical weight. Many pioneers treated it as a ritual moment, almost spiritual. The hearth flame meant the cabin was alive, a place where human warmth had finally staked its claim in the wilderness. One fact stands out. Early settlers often lit their first fire using embers borrowed from a neighbour's hearth, a tradition brought from Europe. It symbolised community, continuity and protection. Mountain men, though often alone, likely felt a similar surge of significance the first time smoke curled from their own chimney. As usual, lore gets quirkier. Some trappers swore you had to light the first fire with shavings from the same tree that supplied your roof beams, or else the cabin would forever be unlucky. Others claimed if the fire smoked heavily on the first night, it meant the land was haunted and the cabin wouldn't stand. Superstition or not, those stories reveal how much weight men put on that initial blaze. It wasn't just fuel, it was fate. And the scholars? They argue about just how effective these early chimneys were. Some evidence shows that poorly built fireplaces smoked constantly, choking the air and forcing men to keep doors and windows cracked even in midwinter. Others suggest that many hearths worked surprisingly well, built with inherited skill or learned from native tribes who had long traditions of indoor fires. The truth probably varies. Some cabins filled with choking soot, others warmed with steady flames. Either way, the first fire was always a gamble. Back in your cabin, you crouch before the hearth, flint and steel in hand. You lay curls of birch bark at the base, their papery skin ready to catch. Over them, you stack dry twigs, then thicker sticks, then a log split thin enough to bite quickly. You strike steel against flint, once, twice, until a spark lands, glowing like a firefly. The bark smoulders, curls, then bursts into orange light. You lean close, breath steady, coaxing it upward until the twigs snap and crackle. The flames climb, greedy and alive, licking the rough stones. Smoke coils upward, momentarily filling your eyes with tears, before it finds the throat of the chimney and vanishes into the night. Relief floods you. You add another log, then another, watching the fire catch strong and sure. The cabin fills with flickering warmth, shadows stretching across the walls like dancers summoned by your will. For the first time you sit back on your heels, no longer shivering. The heat radiates into your chest, loosening the knots in your muscles. The smell of smoke mingles with the sharp tang of resin and the earthy damp of mud chinking. Your ears fill with the crackle of flame, a sound that feels like a heartbeat answering your own. You grin despite yourself. You've lit the cabin's soul. As the night deepens, you lean against the logs and let the firelight paint the inside of your eyelids. Outside, the wind claws at the walls. Snow hisses against bark, but in here the warmth pushes back. You think of the men who came before, those who failed and froze, and those who survived because they made it to this very moment. You're part of that chain now. When you finally lay down, the hearth still glowing at your side, you realize something profound. This cabin is no longer just a structure. It's alive, because fire breathes within it. And as long as you keep feeding those flames, winter may claw, but it won't claim you. Not tonight. The fire hums low in the hearth, the roof groans softly under a settling weight of snow, and the door thuds against its rawhide hinges as the wind tests it. You've built yourself a box against the storm, but inside it's still barren. Just a dirt floor, smoke-streaked walls, and a single blanket tossed near the flames. You realize now that survival isn't just about shelter from the elements. It's about shaping the inside of this cabin into a place you can actually live. Without furniture, storage, and a place to stretch without lying in ash, you'll go stir-crazy long before the snow melts. Time to turn spare wood into the comforts of a rough home. Historically, frontier furniture was as practical as the men who built it. Rough-hewn stools, plank tables, and bunks nailed against the wall made up the essentials. Fact, many early cabins included raised sleeping platforms to avoid the damp chill of dirt floors, often filled with straw piled high with furs. Shelves carved directly into the wall stored tools and food. Nothing was ornamental. Every piece had to earn its keep. Yet for all their plainness, these items were proof of civilization creeping into the wilderness. The quirky tales about frontier furniture reveal a streak of humour. One mountain man supposedly carved a chair so uneven it rocked constantly, but instead of fixing it, he bragged that it was self-rocking. Another story tells of a trapper who built his bunk so close to the fire that sparks regularly singed his blankets, yet he refused to move it because he slept warmer that way. Comfort clearly was a flexible term in the Rockies. Scholars debate just how much effort mountain men put into interior life. Some argue that most kept things brutally simple, just a fire, a bedroll, and meat hanging from the rafters. Others suggest that after weeks in solitude, men often whittled and tinkered, shaping wood into stools, spoons, or even decorative touches to break the monotony. Was a cabin purely a survival shell, or was it, in its own rough way, a home? The argument underscores how thin the line is between necessity and the human urge for comfort. Back in your cabin, you take one of the leftover logs and split it into planks. You shape 2 rough boards and brace them with smaller branches, fashioning a stool. It wobbles, uneven at the legs, but when you sit on it by the fire, your bones sigh with relief at being lifted off the floor. Encouraged, you lash together a simple frame against the far wall, piling it with pine boughs and furs. The raised bed looks crude, but when you lie down it spares you from the damp earth below. That small elevation feels like the difference between surviving and thriving. By midday, you've carved shelves into the log walls, little notches to hold your flint, your knife, and the strips of dried meat you've been saving. You fashion a crude peg from a branch, driving it into the wall to hang your coat. Slowly, the interior of the cabin shifts from a hollow box to a place with order and function. Each small piece whispers back at the wilderness, "This is mine, and I will stay." As the fire burns into evening, you sit on your uneven stool, warming your hands and gazing around. The shadows flicker over shelves, bed and hearth. It isn't pretty, it isn't permanent, but it feels lived in. For the first time, you aren't crouching in survival's bare minimum, you're inhabiting. Later, as you lie on your makeshift bed, the crackle of fire filling the silence, you realise how these small things change everything. A stool, a shelf, a raised bunk. Together they transform a cabin from a shell into a home. It may be the roughest home imaginable, but when the storm rattles the door and snow drifts against the walls, you're no longer just a wanderer huddling in the cold. You're a man with a room, a fire, and a place to belong, however temporary. You've got your stool, your shelf, and your bunk of pine boughs stacked with furs. The fire hums warmly in the hearth, smoke drifting lazily up the chimney. For a brief moment, you almost feel civilized again, until something small scurries across your dirt floor. You glance down, catch the flick of a tail, and sigh. Turns out you're not the only one who thinks this cabin is a fine place to ride out the winter. Companions, welcome or not, are part of the deal. Out here, you share your walls with whoever can slip through the cracks. Historically, mountain men often had dogs by their sides, sometimes brought from trading posts, sometimes strays that found them along the trail. Dogs guarded against intruders, warned of predators, and, most importantly, offered the kind of company silence couldn't provide. One fact: journals from the fur trade mention dogs curled close to their masters in winter cabins, bodies pressed together for warmth. But dogs weren't the only cabin companions. Mice, squirrels, and insects were uninvited but inevitable guests. A man alone in the wilderness rarely stayed truly alone for long. The quirky lore around cabin cohabitants takes some odd turns. One story tells of a trapper who befriended a weasel that hunted mice in his cabin, feeding it scraps in exchange for pest control. Another legend insists a man once raised a bear cub inside his walls, only to have it smash through the door once it grew too large. True? Doubtful. But in the long nights of mountain winters, even the idea of sharing your fire with a weasel or a bear makes for a tale worth retelling. Scholars argue whether these animal companions, dogs in particular, were truly essential or simply luxuries. Some suggest dogs were crucial partners in survival, guarding supplies and hunting small game. Others claim many mountain men went without, unwilling to share scarce food or risk the distraction. The debate highlights a deeper question. Did solitude strengthen these men, or was companionship, furry or otherwise, necessary to keep madness at bay? Back in your cabin, the scurrying grows louder. You spot a pair of bright eyes peeking from between the logs, then darting away as you shift. A mouse, no doubt. Maybe a family of them, happy to steal from your scraps and warm themselves by your fire. You grumble, but deep down you know they're not going anywhere. You tuck your food higher on the wall shelf, double wrap the jerky, and accept the tiny thieves as inevitable cabin mates. As night deepens, the wind rattles the door and snow hisses across the roof. You huddle closer to the fire, and your real companion, your dog, curls beside you. His fur radiates warmth, his steady breathing anchoring you in the silence. When the logs pop loudly, he lifts his head, ears twitching, then settles back down. You run a hand across his back, grateful. In a world where even the trees groan like ghosts, that solid, living presence steadies you more than you'd like to admit. But solitude has its own kind of companions too. When the fire burns low, you sometimes think you hear voices in the creak of the logs, or footsteps in the snow outside. You know it's just your imagination, sharpened by cold and silence, but still. You pause, listening. The cabin keeps you alive, but it also amplifies every sound until loneliness itself feels like a second presence. Maybe that's why even the scurrying mice become oddly comforting. Life, however small, means you're not entirely forgotten by the wilderness. By morning, you wake to find mouse tracks stitched across your dirt floor and your dog nosing at a gap between the logs. You sigh, pull yourself from your bed, and add wood to the fire. Another day begins, shared with creatures great and small, chosen and unchosen. Out here, companionship isn't about preference, it's about survival, and sometimes about simply having another heartbeat in the dark. The cabin breathes warmth now, its hearth glowing like a stubborn heart, its door groaning shut against the storm. You've got a stool, a bunk, and even your dog curled close. But the fire doesn't feed itself, and neither do you. Out here, you're not building a cabin to admire it. You're building it so you can have a place to eat, sleep, and keep your belly full. Without food, all this work becomes your coffin. The next task is as old as survival itself, hunting and storing enough to last through the winter's long starless nights. Historically, mountain men relied heavily on game. Deer, elk, bison, and smaller animals like rabbits filled their traps and bellies. Preservation was the real trick. Fresh meat would freeze outside, yes, but once thawed it could spoil fast. Fact: many trappers smoked meat over low fires, building racks from green branches and letting the smoke dry the flesh into strips of jerky. Fat was rendered into tallow, poured over dried meat and berries to create pemmican, a dense, long-lasting ration borrowed from native traditions. Without these methods, no man could carry enough food to see him through. The quirky stories around meat storage run wild. Some men swore by hanging their venison high in the trees, out of reach of bears, though more than a few returned to find clever animals had climbed up anyway. Others joked about burying meat beneath the snow, only to dig it up months later, frozen solid like nature's icebox. One tale insists a trapper lost half his winter supply because he used his jerky rack as a drying line for socks, and a wolf pack took advantage of the smell. True? Hard to say, but it makes you think twice about multitasking with food. Scholars argue over how much foresight mountain men actually had when it came to storage. Some accounts suggest they were meticulous, carefully rationing and stockpiling. Others hint at recklessness, eating heartily while the supply was fresh and only realizing their mistake when hunger set in. The debate reflects a deeper truth. Not every survivor was wise, and not every winter was forgiving. A single misstep could mean starvation, no matter how sturdy the cabin. Back in your clearing, you shoulder your rifle and step into the snow. The world outside your cabin is sharp and silent, every branch dusted in white, every breath hanging in the air like smoke. You track deer along the creek, their hoofs leaving clean stamps in the powder. Hours pass before you find one, its head lowered to drink at an icy pool. You steady your breath, aim, and fire. The crack echoes through the valley and the deer collapses. The kill fills you with both triumph and guilt, the paradox of survival. Dragging it back to the cabin tests every ounce of strength. The carcass slides across the snow, leaving a red trail behind. Your dog trots ahead, eager, his nose twitching at the smell. By the time you reach the cabin, your back aches, but the sight of the deer hanging from a makeshift rack outside fills you with relief. You skin it quickly, hands stiff with cold, then slice the meat into strips. Smoke curls upward as you build a low fire, laying the strips across green branches. The scent of venison fills the air, rich and earthy, a promise of meals to come. By evening, strips of drying meat sway gently above the smoke, and rendered fat bubbles in a pot near the fire. You stir in berries you gathered earlier in the season, shaping rough cakes of pemmican that cool into dense, heavy blocks. You tuck them onto a shelf inside, knowing each one might buy you another day of life when storms rage and the forest goes quiet. That night the cabin smells of smoke, fat and drying venison. It isn't pleasant exactly, but it's the smell of security. You sit on your wobbly stool, watching sparks leap in the hearth, and feel a rare ease. Food is hanging, drying, and waiting. The wilderness may still be vast and merciless, but tonight you've pulled something from it and claimed it as your own. Hunger won't be your undoing. Not yet. The meat hangs above your smoke fire outside, strips stiffening as they dry. Inside, pemmican blocks sit on the shelf, dense little anchors against the fear of hunger. For now, your belly is steady, your fire alive, and your cabin solid. But winter isn't only about fighting the elements, it's about enduring time itself. Out here, the snow doesn't just fall, it traps. Storms roll in and bury the forest in silence, pressing you into your cabin for days, even weeks. Food may last, firewood may hold, but the real danger creeps in from the inside. Boredom, restlessness, and the madness of too much silence. Historically, men snowbound in the Rockies often turned to small, repetitive crafts to keep from unravelling. Whittling knives carved spoons, bowls, and pipes from leftover wood. Fact: archaeological digs have uncovered surprisingly ornate wooden tools and trinkets in frontier cabins, proof that idle hands rarely stayed idle. Men also repaired gear endlessly, patching moccasins, sharpening blades, and restringing traps. It wasn't just about utility, it was survival of the mind. Busy hands kept despair at bay. Of course, frontier tales paint a wilder picture. Some stories tell of men talking to their rifles as if they were old friends, giving them names and personalities by the third month of snowbound solitude. Others joke that trappers carved chess sets, then played both sides, arguing with themselves over strategy. The line between humour and truth gets blurry here. After weeks without another human voice, it's easy to imagine the mind wandering into eccentric corners. Scholars debate whether loneliness was truly as crushing as the stories suggest. Some argue mountain men thrived on solitude, their personalities drawn to silence and independence. Others insist the human need for company would have gnawed at them, leading to depression, hallucinations, or impulsive risks just to escape the cabin. Diaries reveal both extremes, some men praising the peace of winter, others confessing they nearly lost their minds counting cracks in the walls. Back in your cabin, the first real storm arrives. Snow begins as a whisper, then deepens into a steady hiss against the bark roof. Wind presses at the door, rattling the rawhide hinges until you wedge a log against it. The world outside fades into white. You sit by the fire, knife in hand, shaving curls of wood from a spare branch. At first, it feels like aimless fidgeting, but soon the shape of a spoon emerges, rough and uneven. Hours pass unnoticed as you carve, smoothing the edges with thumb and blade until it resembles something useful. You hold it up to the firelight and chuckle. A lopsided spoon, but your spoon. The days blur into each other. Morning means stoking the fire, checking the smoke racks, adding to the wood pile. Afternoons dissolve into carving, patching moccasins, or fiddling with snares. At night the storm howls, but you drown it out with the rhythm of your knife-scraping wood. The silence becomes a canvas where you paint small rituals, each one keeping your thoughts from turning inward too sharply. Still, the cabin creaks with the weight of solitude. You catch yourself speaking aloud, sometimes to the dog, sometimes to no one. When the fire pops suddenly, you glance up as if it were a companion offering a comment. One night, you swear you hear voices in the storm, distant but familiar, only to realize it's the wind clawing through the trees. You laugh nervously, then throw another log on the fire. The wilderness is vast, but your mind is vaster, and both need taming. When the storm finally eases after days, you push open the door and blink into a world buried in white. Snowdrifts swallow the trees, and the path to your smoke rack has vanished. But you feel strangely renewed. The cabin held, your mind held, and your little pile of carved spoons and pegs feels like treasure. Surviving the cold is one thing. Surviving yourself is another, and for now, you've managed both. The storm finally clears, leaving the world outside your cabin glittering and silent, a white desert stretching in every direction. The path to the creek is buried, your racks of drying meat wear caps of snow, and the trees groan under their heavy coats. For days you've seen no one but your dog and the occasional mouse streaking across the dirt floor. Then, one morning, the sound of crunching snow drifts through the silence. Footsteps, human, deliberate. You pause, hand hovering near your rifle, unsure whether to welcome or fear. The wilderness may be lonely, but it isn't empty, and neighbours sometimes appear when you least expect them. Historically, mountain men were never as isolated as the myths suggest. Trading, borrowing, and swapping labour were lifelines. Fact. Fur trappers often visited each other's cabins during the long winters, exchanging tobacco, coffee, or ammunition in return for food, pelts, or news. It wasn't just about goods, it was about sanity. A fresh face in the doorway could be worth more than gold when snow pressed hard against the walls. Of course, frontier lore turns neighbours into characters larger than life. One tale tells of a man who showed up at a stranger's cabin with nothing but a fiddle, playing tunes so wild that wolves supposedly howled in harmony outside. Another story describes two trappers arguing for 3 days over the last tin of coffee, only to split it by measuring spoonfuls with solemn ceremony. Were these tales embellished? Almost certainly. But they capture the strangeness of human contact after weeks of silence. It could be joyous, tense, or downright bizarre. Scholars debate whether mountain men valued company or guarded solitude more fiercely. Some diaries suggest regular visits, tiny winter communities forming as men clustered together in harsh months. Others insist many went out of their way to avoid contact, clinging to isolation as proof of their independence. Perhaps it depended on the man, or on the mood of the season. loneliness battling with pride in equal measure. Back in your cabin, you open the door slowly and find a figure trudging through the snow. A man in buckskins, hat rimmed with frost, beard stiff with ice. He raises a hand in greeting, not reaching for his rifle. His breath fogs as he calls, "Got coffee to trade?" Relief and wariness mix in your chest. You nod and wave him inside. The cabin fills with new sounds. Boots stomping snow from the threshold, the clink of a tin cup, the low rumble of another man's voice. You share fire and food, pouring him a cup of bitter brew in exchange for dried tobacco and a strip of smoked elk. The taste of it is sharper than you remembered, made sweeter by the fact that it didn't come from your own hand. Conversation is halting at first, words rusty from disuse, but soon you're swapping stories, of near misses with avalanches, of traps stolen by clever wolves, of rumours about a rendezvous far down the valley come spring. The evening stretches into laughter, the cabin alive in a way it hasn't been since you raised the first log. The firelight reflects off 2 pairs of eyes instead of 1, shadows doubling across the walls. For a little while the wilderness outside feels farther away, pushed back by shared warmth and the comfort of another human presence. When your guest finally leaves the next morning, crunching back across the snow toward his own lonely outpost, the cabin feels quieter than before, yet it also feels sturdier, as if the visit left something behind, a reminder that you're not the only soul fighting this winter, and that survival isn't always a solitary act. The wilderness may demand independence, but sometimes it allows, just briefly, the gift of company. The morning after your neighbour's visit, the cabin feels both emptier and warmer. Emptier because the sound of his boots and his rough laughter are gone, leaving silence to creep back in. Warmer because his stories still echo in your mind, glowing embers of companionship to carry into the next storm. Nights by the fire stretch long, and when the wind howls outside, you find yourself replaying those tales, almost as if the voices linger in the logs themselves. Out here, legends grow faster than icicles, and the firelight has a way of shaping shadows into something more than they are. Historically, men on the frontier told and retold stories to ease the boredom of long winters. Fact, many of these tales blurred the line between truth and imagination, mixing real encounters with exaggerations until they became folklore. Ghost stories, sightings of mountain spirits, and encounters with creatures that may or may not have existed were common. Around the fire, history became myth, and myth became survival, a way to make the wilderness feel a little less empty, or maybe a little more alive. The quirks in these tales are endlessly entertaining. Some men swore they'd seen wild men covered in hair, walking upright in the snowy timberline. Others told of glowing lights drifting through the forest, lanterns carried by spirits of hunters long dead. One story insists a cabin itself became haunted, its logs groaning at night with voices of the trees they once were. Whether anyone truly believed these things or just enjoyed scaring each other is unclear, but when the wind moans and the shadows stretch, you understand why the stories took root. Scholars debate whether these ghostly tales were simply entertainment or if they revealed deeper psychological cracks in the solitude of mountain life. Some argue the stories were just frontier humour, the same as tall tales about giant fish or impossible hunts. Others see them as coping mechanisms, projections of loneliness and fear onto the vast indifferent wilderness. Did men really see spirits, or did they just need to believe something else was out there with them? The question remains unresolved. Back in your cabin, the fire pops, sending sparks up the chimney. Shadows leap across the walls and your dog lifts his head, ears twitching as if he hears something you can't. You mutter to yourself, "Just the wind," but still glance toward the door. Loneliness can play tricks, but so can the wilderness itself. The forest groans with shifting snow, branches creak like footsteps, and sometimes the silence between sounds feels almost deliberate. To keep your mind steady, you start telling stories aloud, half for yourself and half for your four-legged companion. You recount the tale of a ghostly trapper whose lantern still swings in the valleys, searching for a cabin he never finished. You laugh softly at your own dramatic tone, but the cabin seems to listen. The shadows lean closer, as if eager for the next chapter. It's absurd, yes, but the absurd keeps the silence at bay. By late evening, you've carved a small figure from spare wood, a crude man with arms raised. You set him on the shelf near the fire, calling him your extra guest. He grins crookedly in the firelight, a silent audience to your tales. Between the dog at your feet and the figure on the shelf, the cabin feels less empty. Perhaps this is how legends are born, not from ghosts in the forest, but from the need to fill silence with something more than your own breathing. When you finally crawl into your bunk, the fire dimming, you catch yourself glancing once more at the door, listening to the wind's song. Maybe there are no spirits wandering the timberline, or maybe, as the old stories suggest, every cabin in the wilderness carries its own echoes. Either way, the legends keep you company, and in the heart of winter, that's all that really matters. The cabin has come a long way since it was nothing more than a rectangle scratched into the snow. Now it stands with walls, a roof, a hearth, and even a door that thuds satisfyingly shut. Yet no frontier cabin stays finished. The cold finds cracks you missed, snow seeps in through seams, and every storm teaches you what you overlooked. Out here, a builder is never truly done. He's a constant tinkerer, patching, adjusting, dreaming of improvements. Tonight, as wind whistles faintly through the upper logs, you realize your cabin is talking to you, reminding you there's always more to fix. Historically, constant modification was the norm. Cabin builders patched leaks with moss or clay, added shelves as supplies grew, and sometimes reinforced sagging roofs with poles cut after the first heavy snow. Fact, archaeological surveys of pioneer cabins show layers of repair, with different kinds of chinking stuffed into the same wall over time, moss at the base, mud in the middle, straw shoved into higher cracks. Cabins were living projects, evolving as the seasons tested them. The folklore around repairs carries its own flair. Some trappers swore that if you patched a roof with sod during a storm, the cabin would never leak again. Others claimed that hammering an old horseshoe above the door kept the logs from shifting too far in the thaw. One tale tells of a man who, tired of smoke filling his cabin, simply knocked a hole in the wall with his axe and called it a window. Practical, questionable, entertaining, absolutely. Scholars debate whether cabins were improved steadily over years or abandoned after a season, only to be replaced with new builds the next winter. Some argue that the constant tinkering points to long-term settlement, while others insist the majority of cabins were temporary shelters, patched just enough to last until spring. The evidence is mixed. Some ruins suggest years of repair, while others appear to have been used once then left to rot. Back in your clearing, you decide it's time for upgrades. First, you stuff more moss into a drafty corner where the wind sneaks in like an unwanted guest. Then you carve a small shelf above your bunk, a place to keep flint, knife, and pemmican within easy reach. Your dog watches as you mutter curses at splinters, the shelf finally holding steady after your third attempt. Next, you tackle the roof. You climb carefully, shoveling off heavy snow and laying fresh bark where water has dripped inside. Each adjustment feels small, but together they weave a stronger cocoon. When evening falls, you sit back by the fire and admire your handiwork. The cabin feels tighter now, less drafty, more efficient. But your mind doesn't stop at necessity. It wanders toward luxury. You imagine a glass window, though the thought is laughable out here. You picture smoother planks for flooring, or maybe a bed frame instead of pine boughs. These are dreams for another life, but they remind you that even in survival, the human urge is always to improve, to reach beyond good enough. As the firelight flickers, you realize the cabin is no longer just something you built. It's something you're shaping over time, responding to its quirks as much as your own. It creaks, it leaks, it groans under snow, and you answer back with patches, shelves, and dreams of windows. Together, you and the cabin are in dialogue, learning to survive one another. That night, lying on your bunk, you run a hand across the new shelf above your head and smile. Perfection is a lie in the wilderness, but progress, that's real. And as long as you keep answering the cabin's whispers with your axe and knife, it will keep standing between you and the storm. Your cabin creaks softly in the cold, the fire hums in its stone cradle, and for a moment you imagine yourself the only soul in this vast white wilderness. But you know better. These mountains have been lived in, hunted in, and walked for centuries before you set your first log in place. Eventually solitude shatters with encounters, sometimes friendly, sometimes wary, with the native tribes whose lands you now share. When you step outside and see a figure across the snow line wrapped in hides, bow slung across his back, you're reminded that this wilderness isn't just yours. Historically, mountain men depended heavily on native tribes for survival knowledge. Fact, many trapping skills, snowshoe design, pemmican recipes, and even techniques for building snug log shelters were borrowed directly from indigenous peoples who had already mastered these lands. Trade was common too, furs exchanged for beads, tobacco, knives or firearms. These exchanges kept both sides alive, though they were never simple or free of tension. The folklore that grew out of these encounters sometimes borders on the unbelievable. One tale insists a mountain man traded away his entire winter's haul of beaver pelts just for a pair of intricately beaded moccasins, the most comfortable shoes he ever owned. Another story claims a trapper, desperate for meat, bet his rifle in a snowshoe race against a native hunter, only to lose and spend the season armed with nothing but a hatchet. Whether these stories are exaggerated or not, they highlight the strange, often personal dynamics that shaped frontier life. Scholars debate the tone of these relationships. Were mountain men mostly respectful, acknowledging the expertise of tribes whose lands they traversed? Or were they opportunistic, taking knowledge while giving little in return? Some diaries show deep friendships, even marriages and alliances. Others reveal suspicion, tension, and violence simmering just beneath the surface. The truth is tangled, woven from cooperation and conflict alike, as survival demanded both exchange and caution. Back in your clearing, the figure approaches slowly, his eyes sharp but not hostile. You lift a hand, showing your palm, then gesture toward the fire inside your cabin. He nods once and follows you in, his boots crunching on the packed dirt floor. The cabin feels smaller with another man in it, the firelight painting his face in amber. You share dried venison, and in return he unwraps a bundle of herbs, their scent sharp and unfamiliar. He shows you how to crush them into tea, a bitter brew that warms your chest better than any coffee. Words are few, your language and his overlap only in fragments, but the exchange is clear enough. He studies your hearth, your moss-packed walls, and shakes his head at your uneven notches, as if to say, "You've got much to learn." You laugh, embarrassed, and gesture as though inviting him to teach you more. For a moment, silence bridges into something like camaraderie. Two men from different worlds huddled against the same winter. When he leaves, slipping back into the trees as quietly as he came, the cabin feels altered. Not larger, not smaller, but connected. Its walls no longer the centre of the world, but a single thread in a vast tangled web of lives. You realise survival here has never been solitary. Every notch in your logs, every scrap of pemmican, every snowshoe strapped to your boots carries the mark of knowledge passed through generations before you. That night, lying on your bunk, you listen to the fire and think of the tea's bitter warmth still lingering in your chest. Encounters like this remind you that the wilderness isn't just a test of your will. It's a meeting ground where cultures collide, overlap, and sometimes learn from one another. Your cabin is your fortress, yes, but it also sits on land that holds stories far older than your own. The cabin groans in the night wind, its rough seams holding, its hearth glowing with a steady pulse. You've sealed cracks, stored meat, and even shared the fire with strangers. Yet when storms drag on for days and silence presses so heavy it feels like an extra log across your chest, you find yourself asking why you're here at all. The physical challenges are relentless, but the mental ones run deeper. Every man who ever built a cabin in the wilderness wrestled not only with snow and hunger, but with his own philosophy of survival, what freedom was worth, what solitude cost, and whether this harsh life gave more than it took. Historically, mountain men carried reputations as rugged individualists, symbols of independence. Fact: many abandoned farms, cities, or even families to carve out new lives beyond the frontier. Their cabins became both refuge and symbol, a place where they answered only to themselves. Yet journals and letters show they were also haunted by loneliness, disease, and the creeping doubt of whether their chosen life was sustainable. The philosophy of survival was never clean. It was a mix of pride, hardship, and compromise. The folklore around this subject carries its own odd weight. Some trappers told of men who swore the wilderness spoke to them, trees whispering advice, rivers offering judgment. One story insists a mountain hermit carved his last will into the wall of his cabin, leaving his philosophy behind. Freedom's worth the frost, but not the grave. Was it truth, myth, or just another fireside invention? Hard to know. But it captures the balance every man sought, between liberty and loss. Scholars still argue about how much of the mountain man image is myth. Was he really the free spirit, content in solitude, or was he often desperate, clinging to borrowed knowledge and fleeting companionship? Some historians suggest the philosophy of independence was romanticised later, while the real men were more complex, wrestling daily with regret and longing. The debate itself mirrors the contradiction of the cabins. Were they monuments to freedom or prisons built by choice? Back in your cabin, the fire pops, and you stare at the flames until your thoughts spiral. You think of what you left behind: roads, lamps, voices in the street, and how different they feel compared to the cold silence of snow pressing against log walls. Out here, you are free. Yes, no laws, no clocks, no voices to obey but your own. Yet freedom carries its shadow. Hunger if you fail, madness if you falter, and death if you misjudge the land. You sip bitter tea, its warmth filling your chest, and weigh those truths in silence. Your dog stirs, shifting closer, a reminder that you're not entirely alone. Still, the question lingers: is this solitude strength or punishment? You run a hand across the log wall, feeling the rough grooves of your notches, each one cut by your labour. Every swing of the axe was an act of defiance, but also of desperation. You tell yourself the two are the same, that choosing this life is victory, not exile. When the fire dies low, you lie awake, listening to the faint hiss of wind against bark. Your cabin is a triumph, yes, but also a mirror. It reflects your determination, your exhaustion, and your doubts. Out here, philosophy isn't written in books. It's carved into calloused hands and measured in nights survived. And as long as the hearth still glows, your answer to the wilderness remains the same. You endure, because freedom, even when it bites, feels worth more than comfort behind another man's walls. The nights stretch long, but one morning you wake to something different. The wind has softened, the air tastes less sharp, and when you push open the door, the world greets you not with endless white, but with a thin trickle of water running beneath the snow. It's faint, just a whisper, but it carries a promise: the thaw has begun. Winter, that old tyrant, is loosening its grip. You step outside and breathe deeply, the air still cold but tinged with something gentler, as if the forest itself has exhaled. Historically, the thaw was both blessing and curse. Fact: pioneers often mark the first creak of rivers and the smell of damp earth as the beginning of survival's second chapter. Snowmelt meant game stirred again. Plants would soon sprout, and trails to trading posts began to reopen. But it also meant floods, collapsing roofs, and the discovery of whatever winter had hidden, sometimes the frozen remains of neighbours who didn't make it through. Spring was relief wrapped in danger. Folklore around the thaw leaned heavily on superstition. Some men swore the first bird you saw after winter foretold your luck for the year. A robin meant prosperity, while a crow meant trouble. Others told of streams that sang louder one year than the next, said to be the voices of spirits rejoicing or warning. One particularly odd tale insists a thaw once revealed a cabin swallowed whole by snow still standing, with a fire miraculously burning inside. Did anyone believe it? Hard to say, but after months of snowbound silence, the imagination runs wild. Scholars debate how quickly the thaw actually turned into mobility for mountain men. Some argue they ventured out at the first sign of melting, desperate for new supplies and company. Others insist many stayed put, wary of avalanches and floods until the land truly opened. The truth likely depended on the man, the snowpack, and the hunger gnawing at his belly. Back in your clearing, you hear the creek gurgle louder, its icy crust cracking and drifting downstream. You walk to your smoke rack, where the last strips of venison hang stiff, and notice a bear track pressed fresh into the slush. The animals are stirring. You grip your rifle tighter, reminded that survival shifts now, from hiding from storms to competing again with the wild for food and space. Inside, your cabin shows the toll of the season. The roof sags under damp snow, mud chinking crumbles in spots, and water drips onto the packed dirt floor, carving tiny rivers. You patch where you can, but part of you smiles at the mess. These scars are proof the cabin stood firm through the winter, even as it groaned and leaked. Each crack feels like a badge, a reminder of nights you endured and mornings you woke to see another day. As the days pass, the snow softens, shrinking away from the tree trunks, leaving dark rings of thawed earth. Birds chatter above, tentative at first, then bolder. The air smells of wet soil, pungent and raw, and the forest no longer lies silent. You step outside and tilt your face to the pale sun, letting its warmth touch skin that hasn't felt true heat in months. For the first time in what feels like forever, you believe, not just in surviving, but in living again. That night, as water drips from the eaves and the fire flickers low, you lie in your bunk and listen. Not to the howls of wind or the silence of snow, but to the steady, patient murmur of the thaw. The cabin has carried you this far through storms and solitude. Now it shelters you as winter loosens its grip, ushering in a season of new challenges. Spring doesn't promise safety, but it does promise change. And change, after all this stillness, feels like a gift. The snow melts back from the cabin walls, leaving muddy scars where drifts once pressed high. Water trickles in rivulets past your doorway, carving the ground into channels that gleam in the thin sunlight. You step outside and look at your handiwork, the crooked roof, the patched seams, the leaning door. It isn't pretty, it isn't permanent, but it stands. Through storms and silence, hunger and doubt, the cabin has been your fortress, your cocoon, your stubborn answer to winter's teeth. And now, as the thaw spreads wider, you realize this rough shelter is more than just a pile of logs. It's a legacy, one that will outlast your boots in the snow. Historically, cabins like this were often left behind once spring came. Fact, trappers moved on with the melt, chasing beaver streams, rendezvous gatherings, or trade posts. Many cabins were abandoned, left to sag and rot, while others were reused by whoever stumbled across them next, trapper, settler, or wanderer. Some even became landmarks, known as so-and-so's cabin, long after their builders had disappeared into history. The wilderness, indifferent, kept what it wanted and swallowed the rest. The folklore around abandoned cabins is rich and strange. Some claimed these lonely shelters became haunted, echoing with the voices of their builders long gone. Others swore they offered uncanny luck. Spend a night in one, and you'd always find food or safety soon after. One story tells of a cabin that stood so strong it outlived 3 generations of wanderers, each man carving his initials into the same log wall until it was more writing than wood. Were these tales true? Perhaps not, but they speak to the way a cabin could become more than a structure. It became part of the wilderness mythology. Scholars debate whether these cabins should be remembered as symbols of freedom or as reminders of exploitation, temporary marks of men carving into lands that were never truly theirs. Some argue they were monuments of resilience, proof of what human will could build with only an axe and grit. Others point out that most were short-lived, practical shells that disappeared as quickly as they were raised, less heroic than history likes to remember. Both views hold weight, and the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Back in your clearing, you walk the perimeter, running your hand across the walls one last time. The bark is rough beneath your fingertips, scarred with your notches and smears of mud. You can almost hear the echoes of your own labour, the thud of the axe, the grunt of hauling, the crackle of that first fire. Every mark tells the story of nights you weren't sure you'd see morning, and mornings you woke to face the cold anyway. You think about what comes next. The rivers are opening, and the trails will soon lead back to trade and company. Perhaps you'll leave this cabin for the next wanderer, a silent gift tucked into the trees. Maybe someone will curse your crooked door but bless your stone hearth when the snow sets in again. Or maybe the forest will reclaim it, moss climbing the logs, roof sagging into the dirt, until only the chimney stands like a gravestone for the winter you survived. As evening falls, you sit on your wobbly stool by the fire one last time. The cabin glows with familiar warmth, shadows dancing across the walls you raised with bleeding palms. Your dog sighs at your feet, and outside the thawing creek sings louder than it has in months. You close your eyes and let the sounds wash over you, the pop of the fire, the murmur of water, the faint promise of spring. This cabin was never meant to be forever, but it was enough to keep you alive, enough to carve your story into the wilderness, enough to remind you that even against the most merciless winter, a man with an axe, a fire, and sheer stubbornness can leave something behind. And that, you realize as the flames flicker low, is legacy enough. The long journey through snowbound silence and crackling fires now drifts to a close, the way embers dim in a hearth after hours of steady glow. You've walked alongside the mountain men, felt the bite of their winters, and traced each step of their labour, hauling logs, notching corners, sealing gaps with mud and moss, coaxing fire into stubborn stone hearths. Their cabins weren't marvels of architecture. They were crooked, draughty, patched things, yet they stood, and in their standing they became defiance etched in timber. Out here, in a land that wanted to freeze every mistake, even an imperfect wall was a victory. Think of how those men endured storms that rattled doors like drums, how they pressed furs tight around their shoulders and whispered stories into the fire's crackle to keep loneliness at bay. They shared company with dogs, with mice, with neighbours trudging through the snow for a cup of bitter coffee and a sliver of news. And when the silence grew too deep, they filled it with tales of spirits, of wild men in the timberline, of cabins haunted by their own creaking logs. The wilderness gave no mercy, but it gave them imagination, and that imagination stitched their sanity together when the days blurred white. Your mind wanders back to their final spring, when ice melted into streams and birds returned, calling across valleys that had been mute for months. The cabins, patched, sagging but proud, stood as quiet witnesses to survival. Some were abandoned, some reused, some swallowed by moss and time, but each carried a story, layered into its walls like smoke baked into stone. So now, as you dim your own lights and sink deeper under your blanket, let yourself feel the hush of those cabins. Picture the last glow of firelight dancing on log walls, the muffled storm outside, the comfort of knowing you've built enough to make it through the night. And with that, let the wilderness fade to a soft dreamscape where every crackling ember promises rest. Probablemente ambas. La palabra otra vez sigue latiendo en tu cabeza mientras te alejas de la telaraña. La tierra bajo tus pies es más firme ahora, más segura, pero eso no significa que estés a salvo. Aquí, la estabilidad no es promesa, es tensión. El tipo de calma que llega justo antes del trueno. Lo sientes en el aire. Algo está por cambiar. Y no es solo el clima, es el destino. Has llegado a la última región antes del final, y no es cualquier terreno. Es un espacio donde los mitos africanos hablan del futuro, pero lo hacen con una claridad que incomoda. Aquí no hay oráculos de túnicas largas ni bolas de cristal. Aquí el destino se manifiesta en objetos simples, en sueños compartidos, en niños que hablan como ancianos y en piedras que se niegan a quedarse quietas. El concepto de destino, o fate, si quieres sonar más universal, se expresa de forma distinta en muchas culturas africanas. Para los Yoruba, por ejemplo, todo ser humano nace con un ori, una especie de conciencia interior, un espíritu personal que decide tu propósito antes de que tú nazcas. Tu cuerpo nace en la tierra, pero tu ori ya hizo planes allá arriba. Buen viaje. Y claro, eso tiene consecuencias, porque si tu vida se desajusta, si sientes que todo va mal, puede que no sea culpa de tus decisiones. Puede que hayas perdido conexión con tu ori. Y si eso pasa, más vale que tengas a mano a un babalawo, un sacerdote de Ifá, alguien que sepa leer el destino a través de los odú, los versos sagrados, y pueda guiarte de regreso. Pero no creas que esto es rígido. El destino para muchas culturas africanas no es una línea trazada en piedra, es una danza, una que tiene ritmo, dirección, pero también espacio para improvisar. El ori puede darte un guión, sí, pero tú decides si lo conviertes en tragedia, comedia o algo que no tiene género todavía. Te encuentras con un claro abierto donde hay una figura agachada frente a un tapete de arena. No dice nada, solo mueve semillas, huesos pequeños y caracoles con una precisión milimétrica. Está leyendo algo que tú no ves. Una historia que ya ocurrió pero aún no pasa. No te mira, pero dice en voz baja, lo que buscas no está delante, está debajo, debajo. La palabra te atraviesa, porque entiendes que lo que viene no es algo que tengas que alcanzar, sino algo que tienes que desenterrar. En los mitos del pueblo Ewe, se habla de espíritus que guardan secretos del futuro enterrados en los campos. Quien camina sobre ellos sin saber, no los activa, pero quien escucha con los pies, los despierta. Y tú ahora estás escuchando. A lo lejos se escucha un tambor, no rítmico, no alegre. Es un golpe seco, cada tanto, como si alguien marcara los segundos. En muchas culturas, ese tipo de tambor significa que se está tomando una decisión más allá del mundo visible. Alguien, un espíritu, un dios, tu propio ori, está revisando tu archivo espiritual, viendo si mereces una segunda oportunidad, o una décima. Otro relato, de la región de los Mosi, habla de un joven que quiso cambiar su destino. Se le dijo que moriría a los 33, picado por una abeja mientras comía mango, así de específico. Él se negó. Juró no comer mango nunca. Mató cada abeja que vio. A los 33 se sentó a descansar en la sombra de un árbol de mango. No comió nada. No vio ninguna abeja. Pero la flor del mango cayó sobre su cuello. Una picadura seca, invisible. Murió sonriendo, porque al menos lo intentó. Y esa es la otra parte del mito. Aquí, luchar contra el destino no es un error. Es parte del viaje. Hay honor en resistir lo inevitable. Hay gloria en desafiarlo. Porque a veces, la simple intención de luchar reprograma el final. Los debates sobre esto son intensos. Algunos dicen que el destino africano es inflexible, circular, como un reloj sin manecillas. Otros argumentan que es profundamente personal, moldeable, íntimo. Pero todos coinciden en algo. No conocer tu destino no te libera de él. Sigues caminando, y en una roca ves una espiral pintada con pigmento rojo. A su lado, un círculo perfecto. Según los Dogon, estos símbolos representan el destino antes de ser comprendido y el destino después de haber sido vivido. La espiral es confusa, caótica, te hace girar. El círculo, en cambio, es simple, clara perfección, pero solo se llega a él después de haberse mareado mucho. Te sientas a su lado. El tambor sigue sonando, no con prisa, no con presión, solo con constancia, como si te recordara que el futuro ya empezó y que tú no eres espectador. Te miras las manos, están sucias, rasgadas, marcadas por todo lo que has tocado en este viaje, y entiendes que el destino no es un lugar al que llegas, es el rastro que dejas cuando pasas, la historia que otros van a contar de ti, la huella que no puedes borrar. Y justo cuando estás a punto de dormirte sobre esa piedra cálida, escuchas una frase que no sabes de dónde viene. Podría ser tu Ori, podría ser el viento, podría ser Anansi disfrazado, burlándose otra vez, pero suena clara. El destino no es saber hacia dónde vas, es saber quién eres cuando llegas. Y entonces el tambor se detiene, el tambor calla y el mundo se queda en pausa, no en silencio, sino en algo más denso, como si todo estuviera conteniendo la respiración. Tú también, porque sabes, aunque nadie te lo haya dicho, que estás llegando al final del camino, no al final de la historia, porque estas cosas no se terminan nunca, pero sí al borde de algo, el umbral. Y del otro lado no hay monstruos, ni dioses, ni animales sabios. Hay algo más inquietante, hay ti mismo. La mitología africana no solo habla del origen de las cosas, o del destino, o del caos disfrazado de elección. También habla del espejo, de ese momento inevitable en que uno se enfrenta a sí mismo no como héroe, ni como elegido, ni como víctima, solo como lo que realmente es. Y eso, créeme, puede ser más aterrador que cualquier bestia mitológica. Caminas hacia una llanura que parece demasiado perfecta. No hay árboles, no hay rocas, solo un suelo plano y suave, casi blanco, como sal reseca bajo el sol, y en el centro un espejo gigantesco, no colgado, no apoyado, flotando, vertical, como si alguien lo hubiera clavado en el cielo y simplemente dejado ahí. Lo curioso es que no te refleja de inmediato, solo cuando te acercas lo suficiente, y cuando lo hace, no te gusta lo que ves. No porque sea monstruoso, no porque sea distinto, sino porque es demasiado exacto. La versión de ti que aparece en el espejo no tiene tu ropa, no tiene tu postura, ni siquiera tiene tu edad, tiene tu esencia, tus decisiones, tus omisiones, todo lo que dejaste de hacer por miedo, todo lo que hiciste por costumbre, todo lo que dijiste con una sonrisa pero sin convicción. Y tú sabes, con esa certeza incómoda que llega cuando ya es tarde, que este espejo es sagrado, no porque esté bendecido, sino porque no miente. En la mitología de muchos pueblos, especialmente los Akan, los Bemba y los Ndebele, existen rituales donde el alma debe mirarse antes de entrar en la siguiente etapa de existencia. No es juicio, no hay jurado, ni balanza, ni libros de pecados, solo una imagen. Si puedes verla sin apartar la vista, pasas. Si no, bueno, vuelves a empezar, a aprender otra vez lo que no quisiste mirar. Este momento tiene muchos nombres. Entre los Yoruba se asocia con Ipinu, el acto de rendición, no a un dios, a uno mismo. Para los Fang es el punto de reencuentro con la parte que siempre estuvo callada, y los Ashanti lo llaman la verdad sin palabras. Y aquí estás tú, frente a eso, sin música, sin narrador, sin efectos especiales, solo tú y el reflejo de todo lo que fuiste y no fuiste. Lo soportas. No lo entiendes del todo, pero lo soportas, porque ya pasaste por mucho, porque ya viste a los monstruos, a los tricksters, a los héroes que mueren y los que se niegan a reencarnar. Ya escuchaste las voces del desierto, ya bailaste con los dioses y caminaste con las bestias, ya viste el cielo por dentro y el tambor del destino por fuera, y ahora sabes que lo más sagrado, lo más peligroso, siempre estuvo en ti. El espejo se disuelve como si nunca hubiera estado, la llanura también, y te encuentras en un terreno que no reconoces, pero que sientes familiar. No es una selva, no es desierto, no es montaña ni sabana, es una mezcla de todo, como si todas las etapas de este viaje se hubieran plegado sobre sí mismas para darte un último tramo. Hay fuego a lo lejos, no como destrucción, sino como señal. Hay agua también, un riachuelo que no corre, sino que espera. Y hay voces, muchas, algunas que ya escuchaste, otras nuevas, algunas que suenan como tu madre, otras como un niño que todavía no ha nacido. No dicen palabras, solo hacen presencia, y eso basta. Este es el punto donde, según algunos relatos, el alma elige. No elige entre cielo e infierno, eso aquí no existe. Elige entre seguir, volver o simplemente disolverse. Sí, eso también es opción. Dejar de ser para formar parte de todo, como la lluvia que alguna vez fue nube, y antes de eso, océano. ¿Y tú? ¿Qué eliges? No lo dices en voz alta, no hace falta. El mundo, este mundo, ya sabe. La tierra lo sabe, el aire, y tú mismo, aunque no lo admitas. Hay un zumbido suave, no eléctrico, humano, como un canto sostenido por muchas gargantas. Se parece a los cánticos que escuchaste en las primeras aldeas, pero más profundo, más antiguo, más tuyo. Cierras los ojos, no para dormir, para recordar, y entonces el viaje termina. No con una explosión, ni con una despedida dramática. Termina con una frase, casi imperceptible, que te dice, como si alguien se inclinara junto a ti para susurrarla en la oreja: gracias por escuchar. Y ahora que el viaje ha terminado, puedes volver a respirar normal. Bueno, tan normal como se pueda después de caminar por desiertos donde los dioses sueñan con desaparecer, bosques donde las palabras tienen patas, y ríos donde el amor sabe más a pérdida que a promesa. Puede que no te hayas dado cuenta, pero lo que acabas de vivir no fue solo una historia, fue un mapa, uno sin norte, uno que no te lleva a ningún lado, pero que te obliga a mirar dónde estás parado, porque eso es lo que hace la mitología africana cuando te entregas a ella sin filtros ni categorías. Te desarma con sus contradicciones, te marea con sus símbolos, y luego, sin pedir permiso, te deja distinto. Ya no ves a los dioses como inalcanzables, ni a los héroes como perfectos. Entiendes que el truco no está en adorar, sino en escuchar, y en sobrevivir, a veces con honor, a veces solo con ingenio, y eso es suficiente. Así que mientras el tambor de tu mente empieza a callarse y tu cuerpo por fin se acomoda sobre la cama, el sofá, la colchoneta o donde sea que hayas estado escuchando esto, solo te queda una cosa por hacer: guardar el eco. No la historia entera, esa ya se irá desdibujando como todas, sino un fragmento, una frase, una sensación, algo que, cuando despiertes, no sabrás de dónde vino, pero sabrás que era para ti. Así que duerme tranquilo, las deidades están ocupadas, los tricksters están cansados, y tú, por fin, puedes cerrar los ojos.